If you've watched my last 3 videos, you'll know by now that I'm kind of insane about representation, especially relating to Filipino culture. Originally, I only wanted to make a video about Saints of Storm and Sorrow by Gabriela Buba because I feel like the representation in that book is not good, down to the references she used. Then I read Black Salt Queen, which I also had some issues with, but in a different way from Saints. I decided to talk about them together so that this would be more of a discussion about Filipino fantasies by diaspora authors rather than just a rant review. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad these books exist. I'm also an artist in the Filipino diaspora and I desperately want more stories, especially fantasy, that draws from our culture, history, and mythology. If anything, I want more people to read books like these and to talk about them. If you have read and liked either book, that's fine. I wish I liked them. But I don't, and while that's in large part due to the writing and the plot, I'm not really going to talk about that in this video. Ever since I completed my thesis and have begun exploring new projects that also take inspiration from the Philippines, I have developed a terrible fear of doing a bad job at representing Filipino culture. As such, I'm very critical of myself and how I approach representation, and that intense scrutiny then falls onto others doing similar things. To be clear, I know that expecting scholarly levels of expertise on the history and folklore of the Philippines to write a piece of fiction is unhealthy. I also know that research is difficult because I'm really bad at it. So when I'm going to make my critiques, it's not from a place of authority, but rather as someone who knows enough that certain things stick out to me. If I happen to be wrong about anything, absolutely correct me in the comments. Anyway, if I can't offer a proper and reliable in-depth analysis on the cultural influences of Saints of Storm and Sorrow and Black Salt Queen, you might be wondering what the point of the video is. While I may not be the most qualified person to start this discussion, I want to do it because I barely see anyone talk about it. In the grand majority of reviews I read, not many people pointed out the rep, and those that did generally had good things to say about it, whether the review had a high or low rating. Although I'm seeing a lot more critical reviews for Saints that I didn't see back when I finished the book. I find all the praise really frustrating because I don't think it's totally earned, but I also know that I am a very particular person, so I want to examine whether or not my feelings come from the right place or if I'm being unfair. In a piece of pure fiction, if you can take creative liberties and mold your sources to fit your story as you need, how do you go about making good cultural rep? Since I'm not going to focus on the plot, this critique should remain relatively spoiler-free, and I'm going to try my best to provide all the necessary context for any given critique I have. Still, if you're planning on reading those books, it might be better to read them before watching this video. Since I read Saints of Storm and Sorrow first, I'll start with that one. It's an adult fantasy by Gabriela Buba that follows Maria Lunurin, a mestiza woman who has the power to control storms. Her goddess wants her to seek revenge on the invading Codicians, but Lunurin doesn't want to risk the lives of those she loves, notably her girlfriend and fellow nun, Catalina. If I had to describe the representation in that book, I would say that it's short-sighted. From the way she talks about the cultural influences of her book in her author's note and in interviews, it's clear that Buba was very excited to share Philippine mythology and culture through her story. However, passion doesn't equate good quality. I think this is most obvious in the language of the book, specifically how Tagalog is integrated. Here's the first instance of it in the prologue. Her Codician blood made her baliw ka. Crazy. For those of you who do not understand Tagalog, baliw ka translates to you're crazy. Ka is a pronoun. Her Codician blood made her you're crazy. Apparently, she had multiple people check the Tagalog in her book, so I don't understand how this went through and I can't see how that's supposed to be intentional. Another instance of incorrect Tagalog I want to point out is the usage of tabi-tabi po, a saying that's still used today with variations across the islands and languages. Tabi-tabi po is said when one wishes to avoid offending a spirit or supernatural being if you happen to pass by or through their territory. It's not a warding spell, which is how Buba chooses to contextualize it in the book. It just feels strange to me for someone to reframe courtesy as magic you can wield. I'm not going to go over every other instance of Tagalog because from here on, it's just lines of dialogue that aren't strictly incorrect, but they do feel awkward. Since Tagalog doesn't appear very frequently and is only used for a single line within an entire interaction, it feels the same as when you want to prove a character in your story is bilingual, so you have them randomly say words in their other language even if the situation doesn't call for it. Even if that doesn't bother you, there are no translations to be found in the book itself. It's not translated in the prose, there's no "no" at the bottom of the page, and there's no glossary. I can understand wanting to highlight our language, and sure, we have the internet, but do you really want to force a reader who's unfamiliar with the language out of the story to translate a single line of dialogue? And this isn't even about appealing to non-Filipinos. What about Filipinos in the diaspora who never learned the language due to assimilation? What about Filipinos who know a different Filipino language? As an extension of language being used weirdly, I want to talk about the names. I'm mostly going to focus on the names of characters here, then focus on place names, the goddesses, and the like when I talk about world building. I can't help but feel like the Filipino characters were named very carelessly. Some of them have really on-the-nose names, but that's not necessarily what I have a problem with. Take the Bicolano story of Mount Mayon, about a beautiful maiden that turns into a mountain and her lover who turns into the clouds that embrace her. The beautiful maiden is called Beautiful and her lover is called Clouds. On-the-nose names are baked into our bones. My issue is that they aren't executed well in this book. Starting with the main character, Lunurin, which means to drown things. I hope I don't have to tell you why that's not a good name, but to make matters worse, Buba is so proud of naming her main character to drown things that she explains it to you in the book, an explanation that she also shares in interviews. Her mother meant it as to drown in blessings, but coupled with her devastating storm powers, she's mostly literally causing others to drown. It might seem clever, but when you consider that the Philippines is a country plagued by monsoons and floods, and our history as a seafaring people, it's difficult to reframe drowning in anything as something positive, and to do so feels tone-deaf. To nitpick further, if we assume drowning in blessings is the meaning her mother was going for, she used the wrong form of to drown. Please look up symmetrical voice or Austronesian alignment. But basically, if Lunurin is the one who is drowning, her name should be Malunod. Unless you phrase it as the blessings are actively drowning her, there is no way to interpret the name other than she's the one who drowns others. Obviously, the second meaning is what the author is going for, but again, in universe, you can't convince me that anyone would want to name their child that. The male main character is named Alon, which means wave, and he has the power to control water. Not the worst thing ever, but then you get this line in the prologue. I knew you'd be one for the sea lady, like me. Your mother thought you'd take after your fire tender cousins, but I knew. Gee, what gave it away? I couldn't help but consider how funny it'd be if he had a name related to fire, but had water powers, which feels like a totally missed opportunity to me. His mother also has water powers, so I guess I can understand why she chose to name her child something related to that, but it doesn't tell me anything interesting about her or her relationship to her child. Alon has a water name because he has water powers. Speaking of Alon's parents, both of them have mistakes with their names. Starting off with his dad, Tigas Dakila. Being named after a quality was pretty common practice in pre-colonial Philippines as far as I'm aware, in which case his name should be Matigas, meaning tough. Instead, he's called Hardness. His surname just means great, but if he's going to have a Filipino surname, why isn't it Aman Alon or Amani Alon? Alon's mother uses Inani Alon, which is reflective of the pre-colonial Tagalog practice of taking your firstborn child's name as your surname, except that's also wrong because Alon is not their firstborn son. Jayan is. I can understand Alon's father not wanting to be Amani Jayan because he disowned him, but what about his mother? Jayan basically only exists in the prologue, and their mother's surname featuring Alon rather than Jayan tells me that he was never considered important to the story. Anyway, circling back to Alon's dad, his thing is that he's a nasty usurper that worked with the Codicians to take power, so he's been converted to Christianity and baptized. Why doesn't his name reflect that? When Raja Humabon of Cebu was baptized, he was renamed Carlos, and his wife Juana. Sure, his name could originally have been Tigas, but why would he keep it? Is that not a sign that he's not fully willing to integrate with Codicians? Which might have been interesting, except that he never at any point shows remorse for allowing colonization to happen. I'll go over the names of some other side characters very quickly. Sinagtala, Bituin, Hiraya, Alon's mother Dalisay. These are all very pretty names to be sure, but they're also some of the first ones that pop up when you Google Tagalog names. Part of what I mean when I say characters are named carelessly is that it doesn't feel like much thought was given to naming them. These names, to me, feel extremely impersonal because they are so generic. They don't tell me anything about the characters besides that they are Filipino. Final name I want to point out is a super minor side character called Bagay. He's some aristocrat for Alon to constantly dismiss. His name can be translated to thing. This is supposed to be an adult book. To be fair, I understand that finding indigenous Tagalog names is difficult. Due to colonization, we don't exactly have an extensive list of authentic names to pull from, and we don't know for certain what would and wouldn't be used as a given name. But we have an idea. From Francisco Collins' Labor Evangelica, this excerpt I got specifically from the Pinay Writer's blog. The method of giving names was the following. As soon as a child was born, it was the mother's business to name it. Generally, the occasion or motive of the name was taken from some one of the circumstances which occurred at the time. For example, Maliwag, which means difficult, because of the difficulty of the birth. Malakas, which signifies strong, for it is thought that the infant will be strong. At other times, the name was given without any hidden meaning, from the first thing that struck the fancy, as Daan, which signifies road, and Damo, signifying grass. They were called by those names without the use of any surname until they were married. Then, the first son or daughter gave the surname to the parents, as Amani Maliwag, Inani Malakas, the father of Maliwag, the mother of Malakas. The names of women are differentiated from those of men by adding the syllable in, as Ilog, river, si Ilog, the name of a male, si Ilogin, the name of a female. Perhaps my standards are unrealistically high. Sure, names like Hiraya and Dalisay are not frequently, if ever, seen anywhere in traditionally published fiction. Sure, you don't need particularly profound names for literally every single character in your story. But I hope that I've made you understand that there was room for more care, more meaning, more intentionality. Sorry for going off for so long just about names. Unfortunately, that's not all I have to say about them. Let's look at the demonyms used in the book. The book's equivalent of Spanish colonizers are called codicians, from Spanish codicia, meaning greed. The locals are called Aynilans, from Aynila, after the historical polity and namesake of the Philippines capital, Maynila. I would like to remind you that this is supposed to be an adult novel. In regards to Aynila specifically, not only is the name lazy, it also messes up the meaning of the name. You could translate Maynila to where there is indigo, something Buba clearly references as Alon's family manufactures indigo dye. While I is a word in Tagalog, it's a connector. It can't exist on its own and it doesn't really mean anything. Considering Buba's version of Maynila doesn't seem to have ties to other kingdoms, the way Maynila had ties to the Sultanate of Brunei, why not use the old Tagalog word for indigo? Anyway, I may as well be grateful she did something, even if it's not good, because sometimes she straight up doesn't change anything at all. In the prologue, she mentions Lanao in the south, like Lanao in real life. The goddesses of the book also take the name of real deities without modifying them even a little. If this is supposed to be a work of fiction and an original world, why aren't you making up your own names? This proximity to reality also makes me question why the world isn't more reflective of it. I mentioned before that Maynila historically had strong ties to Brunei. Why is that not reflected in the book? Islam was present in Maynila. Why was that not reflected in the book? This adaptation of our history doesn't feel transformative or authentic to me. I'm gonna go as in-depth as I can with the mythology because I feel like it's necessary. Filipino mythology is not very well known, and while Buba explains her inspirations in her author's note, she doesn't share any specific sources. I don't think Buba is being malicious, but whenever she shares information, we kind of just have to take her word for it, and I find that dishonest. She's not preventing you from looking things up on your own, but what are the odds of someone doing that after reading her book? Especially if you are not Filipino or unfamiliar with that history, are the majority of people going to question her? Beyond giving a false impression of indigenous Filipino spirituality, she's misrepresenting real goddesses by using their names. To fully illustrate how dangerous this is, I'd like to give a concrete example. If you look up Halia, you'll find that she was a Bicolano moon goddess who was known for wearing a mask. Sometimes she's described as being a warrior, needing to defend herself from the Bakunawa, a moon-eating serpent. Now what if I told you Halia might not actually exist? The Aswang Project has a neat article about her, talking about her origins and whether or not she might have really existed. But here's the important thing from the article I wanted to point out. Remember how I said one of Halia's defining characteristics was that she wore a mask? Yeah, a guy made that up in the late 80s because he thought it was a cool visual. And you know what? It is cool. But now it's spread as something true about the goddess since pre-colonial times. When there's so little information out there, it's easy to make things up and pass it around as fact. Even if it's unintentional, you can't deny the damage it can do to our understanding of the past. Before talking about the goddesses individually, I'd like to cover the creation myth she uses. It's important to note that Buba supposedly made sure to specifically pull from Tagalog mythology, because she is Tagalog and the story centers Tagalogs. Not only does she claim that the creation myth is Tagalog, but also that it features Amihan, Amansinaya, and Bathala. However, when I tried looking into it, I did not find any evidence to support either claim. For those of you who are unfamiliar, here's how the myth goes. In the past, there was no land, only sky and sea. One day, a kite wishing to land but having no place to do so made the sea and the sky turn on each other. The sea tried to reach the sky with her waters, but the sky threw stones at her, pinning her in place and forming the archipelago. The kite finally lands and pecks a reed or bamboo from which the first man and woman come from. While I did abridge the story for the sake of time, it's important to note that I didn't edit out the names of the gods, because there is no mention of them in the version I found. The oldest documentation calling this a Tagalog myth comes from Mabel Cook Cole's Philippine Folktales, originally published in 1916. However, we can find even older documentation of this myth by Miguel de la Orca, 1582, and the Boxer Codex, circa 1590, that attributes the myth to the Visayans, specifically the Hiligay Nun of Panay and Buglas, according to Miguel de la Orca. I've tried looking for the version that names Amihan, Amansinaya, and Bathala. It certainly exists on the internet because it's mentioned every time I look up Amihan specifically, but I struggle to find sources that aren't before the 2000s. This isn't to say that the Tagalogs definitely didn't have such a creation myth, we just can't be certain that they did. So Buba didn't really do her research for this myth, but there's a pretty good reason for that. I neglected to mention that according to her author's note, the version she knows comes from her grandmother. I don't want to discredit the importance of stories passed down through families, but we're once again in a situation situation where we just kind of have to take her word for it. We don't know if this story has been passed down through her family since time immemorial, or if she read it in a book one time and started sharing it with her family. It's also entirely possible that Buba's lineage isn't just Tagalog. We can't know for sure, and I'm not advocating for Buba to share her family tree with us or to grill her grandma for information. I'm not necessarily against Buba featuring the myth as she knows it because it comes from her grandma. Maybe there's evidence I haven't seen that supports Buba's version of the story. Personally, I think it's reckless to frame this as the Tagalog creation myth when there's very little historical evidence to support that. As for the goddesses, I don't know what kind of research Buba did, but considering all it took for me was some light Googling to find information that contradicted her in some way, it gives a bad impression. The articles I'm referencing are from 2020-2021, and while I don't know the timeline of the book's development, she certainly had the time to find the same information I did. In terms of books, I've only read snippets of William Henry Scott's Barangay, but from what I gleaned, I don't think Buba got her mythology from there. Maybe there are other books that she has read and that I haven't, or she got all her info from her grandma, but I can't say for sure. Anyway, you might have noticed that whenever I say real goddesses, I always put weird emphasis on the real part. And that's because for each goddess, there's a certain degree of not being sure they existed historically. At the very least, they don't exist in the way Buba claims they do. Starting off with Amihan because she's the most elusive of the three. I can't seem to find any concrete information about her. If she isn't the bird that brought forth the first man and woman, she's the northeast wind to Habagat's southwest wind, which happen to be the terms in the Philippines for the dry and wet seasons. Looking for Amihan in Barangay, it's always used in reference to the winds or a cardinal direction, never referring to a deity of any sort. When I try to find her in lists of Tagalog deities, she's never mentioned. You might think it's a good thing that she never actually existed, because then the use of her name would not be problematic. Except that in her author's note, Buba explains that Amihan the bird was a real deity. The validity of her existence aside, Amihan today refers to the cool northeast winds, so I find it very peculiar that in the book, Buba made her the goddess of fire and volcanoes. Why? I understand it would be redundant for there to be two wind or sky-related deities, in which case, why not make the sky god the originator of fire? In the myth, they throw stones into the ocean. That's not very storms and sky-themed to me. Otherwise, just give the bird a fire-themed name. Moving on to Amansinaya, which is a name that does show up in historical documents of Tagalog deities. However, he's not a goddess. Remember that excerpt about Tagalog naming conventions, specifically the surnames? Amansinaya clearly means father of Sinaya. While Sinaya could have been a goddess herself, we don't know that, and that's certainly not the name the author uses. You could argue that Buba purposefully gender swapped the god to fit her narrative, but I don't think she even knows she did that. From her author's note, Amansinaya is the primordial Tagalog goddess of the sea and protector of fishermen. Not only is she wrong about the god's gender, but also his role. Amansinaya was only the patron god of fishermen. The Tagalog god of the sea is Haik. I am aware that if you look up Amansinaya, you will find many places claiming that he's a goddess, but it's also not that difficult to find places that say otherwise and tell you why. Finally, we have Anitun Tabu. Firstly, replacing one deity for another, essentially out of spite, is a choice. Secondly, replacing a deity from one ethnic group with another's is really bad. If you look up Anitun Tabu, you'll find many places saying that she is a Tagalog goddess of wind and rain. That's according to Felipe Landa Jocano and his book Outline of Philippine Mythology, which came out in 1969. I've otherwise not found older sources naming the goddess. According to the Pinay writer, Jocano has reassigned the Sambal, Kapampangan, and Pangasinan deities to be Tagalog without properly sourcing his claims. I haven't verified this for myself, but she researches this stuff for a living, so I don't think it's unreasonable to believe her. Case in point, while I can't find old sources mentioning a Tagalog goddess, Anitun Tabu, I did find a Sambal wind god documented by Domingo Perez in 1680 called Anitun Tao. You might not think it's that big of a deal because it's all Filipino, but you wouldn't say a Roman god is the same as a Greek god, right? Even if the figure is functionally the same, those are different cultures. If you don't acknowledge that, it leads to erasure, which I would assume you want to avoid when part of the point of your book is representation. What I'm about to discuss is still related to representation, but it's not something in the text. I haven't listened to the entire audiobook of Saints, but I got to hear parts of it. Dante Bosco can't pronounce Tagalog words to save his life. For instance, he calls Lunurin Lunurin and Alon Alon. Hear me out, I don't want anyone to feel guilty for not sounding Filipino enough. If you never learned your culture's language due to assimilation, I understand. However, if you're mispronouncing the names of your main characters in your anti-colonial book, I do think that's a little ironic. But I don't blame Dante Bosco, because while I was trying to learn more from interviews, I learned that that's also how the author pronounces those names. Listen, if she can't help how she pronounces things, that's fair. I don't want to be an asshole about it. But when you have the option to hire professionals who can say things correctly, and you choose not to, in fact, you choose a celebrity voice actor who stars in the show you keep comparing your book to, it doesn't reflect very well on your intentions, no matter what they were. I probably wouldn't be as bothered by the world building of Saints if Booba actually did any world building. Instead of being immersed in a fictional world, I can see right through it, straight to all the bad research it's built on. But research is only half the battle. Even if you do the work to learn everything there is on the history and culture, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll adapt it well. Black Salt Queen is a book about 3 women written by Samantha Bansil. Haraduja Gatdula, the current ruler of Mainara, has the power to wield the earth, but her strength is waning. Laya, her daughter and heir, is eager to ascend, but her mother finds she lacks maturity. Laya isn't the only one eyeing the throne, as Imeria Kulao, the matriarch of a rival family, has schemes to give her son a high-ranking position. I haven't found a pronunciation guide for this book anywhere, and I don't know how it is in the audiobook, but I'm choosing to pronounce it Duja, not Duha. Anyway, I will start off by saying that I appreciate that the names of people, places, and deities are original to my knowledge. None of them stuck out to me in a bad way. I also appreciated the references to pre-colonial indigenous Filipino traditions, like the 9-day wake and spirit houses. But it wasn't enough to make up for the things that bothered me. Now, I'm not a writer. Prose isn't typically something I want to comment on. My thoughts on the voice of a story is mostly up to personal preference. I wouldn't normally consider it meaningful critique. However, I found the descriptions of people and places frustratingly vague. I'm not asking for multiple pages detailing the appearances of everything, but I found that the book did very little to really immerse me in the world. The vocabulary was very generic. Bansil mentions carriages, palaces, skirts and blouses, maids. Yes, there would sometimes be specifications like how a window screen would be paneled with capiz shells, or that a dress would be made of pongee silk, but they were rare, and it otherwise didn't feel that different from reading any other fantasy. Western fantasy is so widespread that we already have an idea of what these things look like in that context, but not as many people are going to have a mental image of fantasy Southeast Asia. While I'm aware of what that might look like, I have aphantasia. I can't distract myself with my own picture of the things that are being described, so I'm left with only the words. And I find that they aren't doing enough to visualize the world to someone who isn't already familiar with pre-colonial Filipino culture. At least that was my impression when reading. I unfortunately can't give very concrete examples. Since I read Black Salt Queen on Libby, I no longer have the loan and I'm not gonna wait to get it again for the video. Because the descriptions were so vague, I found myself struggling to understand the world building. This is a pre-colonial Filipino fantasy, but out of nowhere, boats have motors. But then I don't recall anyone using anything like a gun. All armed combat was done with swords or magic powers. You could argue that they don't need guns if they have magic, but only a select few get to wield it, which makes the lack of firearms all the more suspicious to me. Also, there's this minor thing that kept bothering me every time it came up. Carriages. Whenever a carriage is mentioned, you never get to know how it's actually moving. We know that it's driven, but that's about it. Is it drawn by horses who are not native to the Philippines? Carabao maybe? But no animals are ever brought up in relation to carriages, so maybe it's a motor. Then how come the first mention of a motor is when they're on a boat? I know this is nitpicking, but when the book doesn't give me very much to work with, I can't help but nitpick. I'm not doing this to be a hater either. I want to feel like this is a full world that I can believe in, but it's not doing enough for me. Because I feel like I have to fill in the gaps myself, I get confused when the book introduces stuff to me that are original to the world but contradictory to what I know in real life. For instance, this book has not one, but 2 of the Philippines. There's Mainara, the place where we spend all of the book based off of pre-colonial Philippines, and then we have Orfelia, a neighboring country that we only hear about, which was colonized and renamed after the colonizer's king. What could that possibly be a reference to? I do find it interesting, so I'm not saying that Bansil shouldn't have done this. For instance, it allowed for commentary on the idea that the colonized people let colonization happen, or that they didn't fight back hard enough, which is an absurd notion and not true. The book knows this and says so. However, I don't think it's the best in terms of actual representation. Fiction doesn't exist in a vacuum. Regardless of whether or not it's reflective of your actual views, you're going to be saying something about the real-life things you're drawing inspiration from. Orfelia's indigenous language and culture was completely eradicated. Orfelia has lost, but that's not true of the Philippines. Without even considering indigenous peoples, many of our indigenous traditions still exist in some shape or form today. Of course, it's not the same as it was pre-colonially, but they still survived. We still have our native languages. We are not entirely cut off from our roots. In fact, Orfalea being a separate entity from Maynara implies to some degree that post-colonial and pre-colonial Philippines are two separate entities, and I don't like that. It implies that we can't go back, that it's too late for us to know who we are. I'm not saying that Bansil thinks this, but this is what the book is communicating to me. Yes, colonization has done immeasurable damage to our history and our identity, but while we have lost many battles in the past, that doesn't mean the war is over. Anyway, I talked a lot about Orfalea, but what about Maynara? It's a bit of an exploration of how pre-colonial societies could have evolved without colonization. It's important to note that colonizers did try to take the kingdom, but they got ousted before anything could really happen. Also, it's still a work of fiction. I know that it's not speculation built on our actual real-life history. I'm not going to be mad that so-and-so historical polity doesn't have a direct equivalent. However, I find that Maynara is still strangely westernized. For instance, a lot of buildings are built with stone. Intramuros is a colonial thing. The bahay na bato was invented in the colonial era. I'm not saying indigenous people can't build with stone. I'm also not saying that they wouldn't ever choose to start building with it. My question is why? It's not that we needed the Spanish to teach us to build with stone, we just didn't need buildings with stone foundations. I have to assume Maynara also experiences typhoons and earthquakes. So wouldn't they want to build a majority of their buildings with renewable and flexible materials that wouldn't cause too much damage if it fell apart? I know there are also volcanic eruptions, but stone isn't any better at protecting you from that than wood. You just gotta get out of there. There's also the question of stories and how they're passed down. In the book, there are a lot of mentions of Maynara's literature, and one of the characters is made to read a bunch of history books. Why? Pre-colonial Philippines did have writing, but it wasn't for history. Stories were passed down orally, and while I'm not saying that indigenous people may never turn to writing, I ask again, what would push them to do that in this world? If their cultural practices were never deeply disrupted or straight up erased, why would they change? Unless you mean to tell me that this world always used writing as their primary means of record keeping and storytelling, to which I say that's not good representation, because that's not reflective of our historical practices. Finally, I have a nitpick about the clothing. Not that it's described very precisely, but the few times that there are references to colonial era dress. I'm talking about the sleeves. The book describes a character as having pagoda sleeves and another character's dress having butterfly sleeves. This isn't to say that we can't claim the Maria Clara gown or terno as Filipino culture, but in universe, I don't see why the people of Maynara would adopt a style of clothing that comes from the colonizers they rejected. Maybe the in-world justification is that the people of Maynara invented those styles of sleeves themselves, but no matter how you frame it, it's erasure of our actual pre-colonial style of clothing. To me, it feels like there was a missed opportunity to really explore how our indigenous practices could have evolved if not for colonization. This also makes me think of the way we talk about countries in the global south today. Look, we have skyscrapers too. Look at how similar we are to Western society. It furthers the idea that we are only worthy of respect as a country if we emulate Western civilization. I cannot stress enough that I don't think Samantha Bansil is racist. I don't think she believes that, nor do I think she was trying to say that through her work. But when you grow up in a racist society, you will be raised with racist biases, and they may subconsciously manifest in the things you create. Bansil's message is that our indigenous culture is important and worthy of respect, but in some places, I feel like she doesn't really commit to actually showing us what that culture is. Despite the harshness with which I approach these works, I don't want to deny the amount of work that went into them. Writing is hard. Getting traditionally published is hard, especially as an author of color. Research and world building is difficult and time-consuming. They were never going to get everything perfect. Considering they both have jobs outside of writing, it's extremely fortunate that they managed to publish anything at all. I'm not making this video to discourage the authors of these books or anyone else from making something based off of their culture, Filipino or otherwise, especially other people in the diaspora. Not only because I genuinely don't want that, but also because that'd make me a massive hypocrite. For my school thesis, I made a 62-page comic inspired by pre-colonial Filipino culture and mythology, and I feel a lot of ways about it. Of course, I'm proud of what I managed to accomplish, but I'm also deeply afraid of the mistakes I made in regards to the representation. Mistakes that I wasn't and might still not be aware of today because of my gaps in knowledge. I could have done something else for my thesis and avoided these problems altogether, but I didn't want to. It was important for me to allow myself to make these mistakes so I'd be less afraid of doing them in the future. I'm not saying that these authors are horrible people for making mistakes. There may come a time where someone much more knowledgeable than me looks at my work and tells me that I did a terrible job. I've been hesitant to make this video because if that were the case, what right do I have to criticize them? Like I said before, I'm not speaking from a place of authority. I am a fellow artist who wants more media representing my culture. Naturally, I also want that culture to be represented well. Of course, I'm going to be really frustrated when I see that it's not really done well, especially when it seems like the majority of people don't see it that way. I'm not making this video with the expectation of getting a response from Buba or Bansil. In fact, I'd be perfectly happy with them never knowing this video existed. Perfect representation is unattainable. Even if you don't consider the lack of reliable primary sources, the Philippines is an unfathomably diverse country with over 100 languages and ethnic groups. No one is ever going to single-handedly represent all of it. Absolutely focus on a specific point of history, ethnic group, or myth, but that precision doesn't mean you get to cherry pick only the parts you like about our history and culture. That's disingenuous. Here's where I'm supposed to tell you how to do good representation, but I can't actually tell you. What might be peak representation to me could be the bare minimum to someone else, in the same way how these books might seem groundbreaking to others, but are barely scratching the surface from my point of view. I can only ask that you do your best, be respectful, and exercise common sense. Maybe this was the best Buba and Bansil could do with the resources they had. I can't fault them for that. But that doesn't exempt them from criticism either. I can only hope they improve as they continue their writing journey. If you're going to tell me that representation isn't important or that it's not that deep, I'm ignoring you. If you liked these books or felt seen by the representation, I can't take that away from you. Feel free to tell me why. I'm genuinely curious and I promise I'm not going to fight you over your opinion. To those of you who have not read these books and were planning to, I still think you should read them. You shouldn't take my word for the representation stuff if that matters to you. You should see that for yourself. If not for the representation, you might just like the story that's being told. I'm not going to make another video reviewing the plot of either book. I didn't like them. And if you really want to know the details, you can ask in the comments. I do, on occasion, read books that I enjoy, so I'd like to recommend some books from Filipino authors. The Sacrifice by Rin Chupeco, which places a diwata in the center of a horror story rather than something more typical like aswang. I don't typically read horror, so I can't say how it measures up compared to other books in the genre, but I found it interesting. The Song of the Mango and Other New Myths by Vida Cruz Borja, which is a short story collection that includes a wide range of genres. There's stuff based off of pre-colonial Philippines, contemporary Filipino folklore, and even some stuff that's unrelated to the Philippines. She also explores a lot of different writing styles, which I think is fun. My favorites are the stories structured like news articles. The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez is a crazy imaginative fantasy with a really unconventional style of telling a story. It's particular enough that some people might have a hard time with it, but I thought it was neat. Feel free to recommend other books from Filipino authors, or any book from any author of color. Anyway, this is very likely the only video of this kind I'm gonna make. I've said what I wanted to say. I also just don't feel really good to scrutinize people who are basically working towards the same thing as me. Plus, this video was way more effort than anything else I've made thus far. I managed to push through because it was important to me, but I don't see myself doing anything like this again in the future. I'll never say never though. Next video will be back to OCs, I promise. See you next month.